Hey Lindsay, how's it going?
Good, thanks. You?
Good, very good. So today we're talking about bipolar mood disorder.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think you know, I think when I first looking into bipolar, I didn't realize how many different types there are. And that it's actually not, I thought it was just literally a kind of state of mania and a state of depression, but actually there's several types.
Yeah, I guess people try and tease out, or they've looked at what are the different types of experiences that people may have, and then have kind of developed a diagnostic system to try and capture that as best as they can with the information we currently have available. So there would be the sort of the classic label manic depression you referred to.
Mm.
That would be bipolar type 2. But there's type 1, which is characterized by having the manic episodes, but not so much the depressive episodes. There's hypomania, which manic episodes, but maybe not quite to the same threshold, and cyclothymia, which is kind of more rapid cycling. So there are different ways of understanding this, but I would agree with you that people tend, just casually and anecdotally, would tend to think of the high highs and the low lows as part of the experience.
And then I think if we just off the back of the previous episode, just sort of
Mhm.
understanding some of the symptoms and, if I contrasted, for example, to borderline or
Mhm.
emotionally unstable personality disorder, that's very much focused on that kind of abandonment, terror, unstable attachment, developmental trauma, relational triggering,
Mhm.
that kind of stuff that happens there. But with bipolar, it seems to be much more circadian driven or biologically driven. It's a biological mood cycling and a neurochemical shift. And there is a
Mm.
potential genetic or family component that then also involves like some kind of sleep disruption. So we just talk a little bit about what are the symptoms? Like what can somebody experience if they have bipolar?
What of the one of the I guess I'm sort of flipping between the symptoms of bipolar and the sort of the links. Maybe you started off with the links to EUPD, or borderline personality disorder, and they can be confused because there can be ways in which things on the surface, at least, might look quite similar. So there may be intensity in the way people are, the way they're speaking, the way they're being with you. There may be impulsivity, self harm. There may be lots of shame around different parts of the person's experience. There could be trauma in the background, or trauma created as a result of the things that happen when people are, particularly in manic episodes, and impact on relationships. So there may be certainly things that look on the
Mm.
surface quite similar, and of course that things can co-occur. So it is entirely possible that someone might receive a diagnosis of a personality disorder and bipolar, so that it's not a mutually exclusive either or. But I think the key distinctions, if we then dig into what are we talking about with this here, and as I do often with these episodes where we're trying to look at or debunk some of the diagnoses, I'm not a psychiatrist, and this would certainly be the preserve of a psychiatrist. But working in this area, becoming more familiar with the territory, bipolar would be looking at episodes where mood shifts. So as you said, it's a mood disorder and mood changes. But what we're talking about is more sustained shifts in energy. So a period of days or weeks or months where there is a noticeable shift either up or down in mood. You also mentioned circadian rhythms or sleep. So that is one of the key things that we would be noticing, perhaps either professionally speaking or in ourselves or in a loved one, is that in a manic episode, a person might be able to manage on far less sleep and still be really quite energized. So in other presentations, not just EUPD, because we were talking about that in the last episode, but in other presentations, people might be having less sleep than normal,
Mm.
but they will likely be feeling exhausted from that. When someone is entering a more manic episode or an elevated episode, they will be having less sleep, but still be feeling really energized, really full of vitality and energy. So that is one of the key distinctions when we might start to be thinking, actually, this is edging more towards what we would think of as a manic episode under the umbrella of bipolar.
And, I suppose if we look at bipolar in contrast to BPD, we looked at BPD as being a kind of personality adaptation based on, things that have happened in childhood. I suppose curious, what are some of the causes of bipolar? Like, is it similar in a way that it's also coming from childhood? Or, you talked about it being, having more of a familial genetic component, but
Mhm.
what would cause it?
So there isn't a test that can be done, blood test or a scan that can just say, right, this gene is present. Yes, bipolar. What we would say is there is a high heritability component, so there is a strong genetic component, but having a family history of bipolar is not destiny. That other people in the family will also go on to develop bipolar disorder. It can be also influenced by stress, vulnerability, life experiences, trauma. So there might be a genetic component that makes you vulnerable to that, but certainly then life experiences and what you grow up with can influence the outcome as well. But there is nothing that is a definitive. So there is, and I think talking about brain injury,
Yeah.
we were talking about before,
Yeah, I think
certainly
I
something
think
that you'd come across.
definitely I've had from a health psychology lens perspective, working with people in sort of brain injury type units. So if you've had sustained, concussions or sustained head injuries, like if you play a sport like rugby, a contact sport, people that develop CTE, which is the chronic traumatic encephalopathy disorder, a lot of them have bipolar as well, because they've actually repeatedly been injuring their temporal lobe. Somebody's had a traumatic brain injury and they've been hit head on in the kind of frontal temporal lobe area. Many of those people also develop mood disorders like bipolar. So this can very directly be caused by something that's happened in that part of the brain. And I think that's really important, is that often there isn't always a cause, right? And to your point, like, it can be trauma from childhood that has given rise, or it could be a really stressful situation that has given rise. It could have a genetic component.
It
But it
could
could
be
also be
substance use. It could be,
substance
yeah.
use. Something is usually some kind of trigger for this. But it could also be that you had a car accident and suddenly things seem a bit different. You're not quite the same person anymore, and something has shifted. And I think if you are around someone where you notice these kinds of changes, it's useful to sort of think a little bit about, hang on a second, what might have happened that led to this?
I guess to take that one step onward, you might have someone who has a diagnosis of bipolar, has the bipolar disorder, but hasn't necessarily got a trauma background or substance misuse history. So it can absolutely be a whole range of things. And I guess I'm mindful we're trying to capture the breadth of the ways in which a person may have developed the bipolar disorder. And I think the thing that's also interesting about trauma is that it's not just about the development of some of these difficulties, but how you then cope with them. So how you then cope with the fallout of after a manic episode or a depressive period, how you then deal with what might need repairing or what might need to be handled or faced up to, how safe you feel in relationships, how safe you feel engaging in services to receive help. So that it's so multi-layered, and can inform things in lots of different ways. I mean, as we know, human beings are wonderfully complex. So I think we would really be looking at trying to get a whole picture, And we've talked about, I guess, from a diagnostic perspective, diagnosis often is a snapshot in time, whereas I guess this would be really unpicking, looking for the patterns, looking what happens over time, looking at when things have started to
Yeah.
escalate, what was happening just before that, and really starting to get a fine-grained understanding of the detail. And that can just lead to sort of, that informs that diagnostic process.
And I think also if you distinguish again between bipolar versus borderline personality disorder, remembering from the previous episode that borderline personality disorder is at a core an unstable identity. It's chronic fragmentation of your identity and this deep, painful emptiness at the core. Like, I don't know who I am. I become a different person in different relationships, and or I disappear when someone leaves me type vibe. That's that piece. But with bipolar, this is much more, the identity is stable between the episodes, but you have this kind of similar self-loathing or shame or some kind of not feeling good about yourself if you have had a manic or a grandiose episode. So that you do have a stable sense of identity, but shame is a real part of bipolar as well. And I think that's where, compassion focused therapy can be really, really helpful to kind of remind people, okay, well, whatever happened during that episode, it might not be your fault, but as your phrase you love saying, it is still your responsibility to kind of deal with it.
Yeah, and I think holding both of those positions is so powerful. Difficult, but
Mm,
really important. Um, I think there can be a lot of myths around bipolar. So you know how often these official, or these terms that are official diagnoses often kind of get thrown around in everyday language, and used really casually. So if someone's had sort of, really upbeat in the morning and then really down in the afternoon, bipolar today, aren't they? Or, that kind of language to talk about that rapid shift in mood. And I think that one of the myths that's important to debunk here is that we're talking about really much more sustained periods of shifts in mood. So this isn't just regular shifts in mood depending on, energy levels or what's happening in the day or how stressful the day is being. These are really quite pronounced and evident shifts that stick around for a period of time. And the I guess to think about what might an episode of mania be like, we might be thinking about a presentation where someone might be much more intense, talking very quickly, rapid talking, might be, use the term grandiose, might be feeling very grandiose, might be feeling, untouchable, I can do anything, invincible. They might spend money they don't have, or engage in risky behavior, or things that might be deemed as reckless behavior because they don't have a sense of the consequences that will come, because they think untouchable. Let's just do whatever I feel like doing. So really characterized by that impulsivity. And if you imagine how that might look for people, and depending on
mm.
where they're at in life, what they're doing, that can really then lead to things that are really difficult when you're back down into a more level space, to have to deal with the things, with the choices you made, with the
The
actions you
fallout.
took.
Mm.
Yeah, the fallout from that is tough. Um,
Yeah,
I
what
think
does it feel like when somebody's about to go into like a manic episode? Like you said, you had a colleague that was sort of
mm,
describing this. Like,
yeah.
what's it like?
So it's I mean, I guess this is an anecdote from one person that I've worked with, so it may be different for other people, but they were able to describe in real detail what it was like to start to enter a manic phase. And their experience was so sensory based. So they said literally colors became brighter, the world became more vivid, everything was more interesting. They had a real sense of possibility, a real hopefulness, a real sense of confidence, a real sense of I can do anything. And I have to admit, it was almost hypnotic hearing the way that they described, and they weren't in an elevated state, they weren't in a manic state at this point, but could really recall what it felt like to start
Mm.
to enter a manic episode. And initially, it felt just fantastic to them. Part of their experience was this belief, it's okay because I'm going to catch it before it flips over into when I do the things that end up then causing me problems, the things that I do that I regret. They're like, not going to happen this time. I'm going to nail it this time. So there was this real sense of, we'll come on to perhaps some of the interventions or treatments that are often in place in a bit, but they were just like, nah, don't need to do those things because I've got it this time. I've got it. So they went through these repeated experiences of not wanting to have this amazing awakening. It really almost became, they didn't describe it as a spiritual experience, but it really sounded as though a technicolor, just
Mm.
everything about their day just felt better.
And I would
And
imagine if you were kind of being medicated, where you that gets taken away, that's kind of the really hard part, is not actually
Mhm.
experiencing those highs anymore.
The journey for them was, it happened enough times where they learned that actually, once they went past that point, if they didn't step in or change things at that point, it very quickly went too far, and
Mm.
the price that they paid stopped that part of it become feeling worth it, and they almost became more anxiously activated when that started to happen, thinking, no, I think I've got this, but experience has told me that I know where this is headed.
Yeah.
So that was their journey anyway, but I really do feel for, who wouldn't want to feel like that?
It does
Who
sound
wouldn't want a
amazing.
day where,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
some of the interventions and the treatments, certainly the behavioral things that could be put in place are about trying to sort of prevent that from being in place, or the medications are about stabilizing some of those experiences. But I imagine that would feel like a real loss. You don't
Mm.
want the second part, if it carries on escalating, but that there will be a time when you think, this is the sweet spot. Can I not just stay here?
Yeah.
And yeah,
But I think in some ways, in the same, when you're thinking about substance, you know, use disorder, there's that sense that you can kind of moderate your substance, whatever it is that
Mhm.
you're addicted to, as opposed to abstain. And I think there's that place of real honesty that someone who
Mm,
has bipolar has to come to, whether they think they can actually moderate and control and pull back on the mood, not let
mm,
it get carried away, or whether they think they would have to kind of abstain from those highs. And I think each
mm,
person is different.
mm.
To your point, there are some clients that they can learn this mechanism to pull themselves back down again, but some people, it's too hard for them to pull themselves down. Once they start heading in that direction, it's intoxicating.
Yeah, yeah.
And for them, I suppose different treatments, including, some of the more psychiatric interventions, are life-saving.
And that phrase, thinking about that point of honesty, I think my experience has been with people, it's more been a really painful process of learning. And it's not a case of kidding themselves or lying to themselves, but just part of how it feels in that moment. Truly, they believe they've got it this time. They're going to enjoy this bit, then they're going to stop, and then they'll do the things that help stabilize and bring things back down. But a process of it needing to not go that way enough times before they think, oh no, actually, no, I want to do things differently. But yeah, I think a real sense of loss that there can be around that. Um,
Yeah, and I suppose
I
it's
think
like
they.
a lot of highs in life. We can get addicted to that high, whether it be from a substance or from a mood, a high
Mhm,
mood. It's
mhm,
intoxicating. And I think,
mm.
like most things in life, learning to moderate is not easy for any of us. Or, kind
Moderating
of,
isn't fun.
no, or
It's
thinking
it's a very
about this.
sensible
I
adulting kind
know.
of.
it's chapter
activity.
6 of the adulting book that it's just not what it was cracked up to be. This sucks. I want my refund. But
Yeah.
it is that sense of kind of sort of remembering and taking responsibility that there is fallout and there are
Mm,
consequences for a lot of things. I mean,
mm,
some people, when they're in the height of their mania, their house gets super clean. Wonderful.
mhm,
But some people
mhm,
in the height of the mania, they spend every single penny they have, or they end up getting arrested, because they're
mm,
doing something really reckless. So I think it is tricky to sort of
mhm.
remember that when you're in the height of the intoxication.
I think that also brings a point. I think it's often a misconception that mania is just happiness, like a super up in a good way. But I think it can become really quite frightening for people to experience that sense of out of control. So we've perhaps described some of the more euphoric aspects to it, but I think that it can equally be experienced as a real sense of things just being out of control, and almost that wheel is just turning so fast, and no matter how fast you go, the wheel just keeps getting faster. So I think that we don't just want to think about it as being up in a positive way, but there can also be then, as you say, lots of financial decision around sexual relationships, decisions around, if you don't believe laws apply to you, you may make choices that you would never normally make if in your sort of more stabilized state.
And
Yeah.
I think, sorry, just to kind of like jump in on that, is that when you're in that kind of high state, it's quite frightening when you can't sleep. And
Mm.
that can be really, really dangerous as well. And I think that can lead to some of the more sort of psychotic episodes that can be quite frightening. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly some people can experience either believing things or saying things that other people would describe as delusional that just don't fit, but you're so in it in the moment. So that might be sort of professionally speaking labeled as a psychotic component or psychotic feature to the presentation. And that can be scary in itself, and even not sleeping at night, sometimes it can be very difficult to be awake when most of the rest of your network or people are asleep. It's thinking can really run away with itself in those times.
And then, of
Absolutely.
course, we have just the alternate, which is the down, which can
Hmm.
be really, really bad for some people.
Mm.
Really, really
Absolutely
scary.
can. It can be just as pronounced as the manic episodes. And I guess what's interesting is if we think from a diagnostic view, so diagnosis happens in, how the person is presenting on that day. So it might be that someone identifies the depressive episodes are really painful and difficult for them. They may not identify as manic, particularly if it's hypomanic episodes, as being problematic. That's almost the relief they experience from the depression. So there can be a real delay in diagnoses, because sometimes what people present with might actually be understood or labeled as depression rather than understood as being this sort of blend of both depressive and manic episodes. Because if you don't think the manic episodes are a problem, you're only maybe relaying half of the picture
Yeah.
to the clinician, and the clinician works with the information that they have available to them. So that can really influence then the treatment options and the support that's given, which may or may not be the best fit for what the person is actually experiencing. Um,
Definitely.
I think that speaks to then often I think people, maybe this returns a little bit more to the mania side of it, but thinking that people with bipolar are dangerous, when in fact my experience is that people are far more vulnerable and dangerous to others, far more vulnerable for putting themselves in positions that they may be at risk of harm or injury or trauma, of financial problems, self-harm, suicide. There can be a lot of risks that come with it that are mostly centered on the individual. It doesn't mean that if you are, in relationship with, or you have a loved one with bipolar, that there aren't also things that you are really worried about and you find difficult as well. But I think that, yeah, the key risks are towards the individual themselves.
And if you are concerned that somebody you know or love is bipolar, what can you do as a person?
loved ones hold such a lot of information about the people that they care about, but we also need to stay away from armchair diagnosing. So it would really be about the person, as long as the individual has capacity, the person going and having a conversation with a professional. Now, it might be that someone might ask for someone that knows them really well to be there in the appointment, because they may have information that is in a bit of a blind spot to the individual. So kind of what they start to notice when things maybe are going into a manic episode, or when they start to notice things are going into a depressive episode, how long those last, then absolutely you can provide support at that time. But more often than not, it would be about supporting the person to access a professional and to start to have those conversations.
Yeah. And I suppose some of the treatments,
Mhm.
dialectal behavioral therapy, supporting with mood fluctuations, mentalization
Mhm.
schema,
Mhm.
psychodynamic psychotherapy, which can take,
Mhm.
um, just some of the understanding of like yourself and stabilizing of yourself.
Mhm.
What are some other things?
I mean, I guess it would almost you would be wanting to think with the person, how do you experience your life? You know, what are the things that come up for you? So it may be for the person, one of the key things for them is the circadian rhythms, is the sleep. So thinking about that, if that's the bit where it really starts to, if we're talking about a manic episode, that's where it really starts to go difficult. You might be looking at more of a CBT based approach to get some real sort of behavioral plans in place, and the cognitive strategies to think about managing that. But it might be that a person is really wanting to work on the experiences of shame that arise from the manic episodes, or the trauma that they've experienced. I guess what I would say is you would very much want the person to be in a stabilized enough place before we would start to do any trauma work,
Definitely.
because that can be,
Mhm.
you need to be resourced enough to be able to do that work.
Yeah.
But with that in place, that may be the focus of where the person wants to go. Or it may be more, people are wanting to think about the different parts of them that are activated, or that how they make sense of their identity with different parts of them. Or it may be they want to focus on relationships, and how they function in their main relationships in their life, in light of bipolar. And so I guess it would depend on what the person wants to work on, because then that opens up the door as to what might be the most helpful therapeutic approach to meet the goals of the person. And we haven't really touched on medication yet, but certainly one of the strongest evidence bases is for a mood stabilizing medication to help. Now, there are people who don't, who use other approaches, absolutely. But certainly, I've seen people really find great benefits in the evening things out. It almost does what it says on the tin, mood stabilizing, and from
Yeah.
there, with that stability in place, then the other work might feel more possible or more
Yeah.
doable.
It's really, I think sometimes it's a good scaffold to be able to do the work that has the longer, more sustainable impact on the
Yeah.
person's life. But if you're too unstable to even start the work, like you've got to stabilize first. That's really, really
Safety
important.
always has to be the
Yeah.
first priority. Yes, stability, because actually I think no matter how good the intention might be for therapeutic work or for trauma-based work, if it's poorly timed, it can actually be more destabilizing than the helpful impact you would hope it would have.
Yeah.
You might also be thinking about relapse prevention plans. So if someone wants to elicit the support of people that know them well, because it may be that other people can notice some of the early warning signs before we become aware of them ourselves. And I guess there's that sort of careful line that you tread between, you're not asking your loved ones to become, your watchdogs, or a team of surveillance experts, but there may be things that you agree when things are more settled. What are the key things? And if I start to notice the key things, what is a helpful way? Like, who should have this conversation with you? How, when, what? would you experience as helpful and respectful language? So there's a lot that can be done to negotiate and to plan ahead for
Yeah,
more helpful ways to feedback some of those indicators. And then the sort of the plan would then say, okay, and once noticed, what then? So then it's kind of
exactly.
having an individualized, tailored plan for what are the next steps that are helpful. And there may be different action plans for either different sets of behaviors that emerge, different scenarios or shifts in presentation that might lead to different outcomes.
Beautiful. Great. And I think on that note, that's the end of today's episode. And thank you very much for joining me today. And until next time, where we will continue to talk about all things health, relationships, and trauma. Till then, take care. The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counseling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.